October 14th, 1961. 11:47 p.m. Leonardo da Vinci Fiumicino Airport, Rome. A man in a wrinkled gray suit stumbled through the arrivals terminal clutching a leather briefcase to his chest, like a child holding a teddy bear. His breath reeked of vodka. His eyes darted between the exit signs and the uniformed carabinieri stationed near the customs checkpoint. He had flown from Vienna on the last Alitalia flight of the evening, paying cash for a one-way ticket, and he had not checked any luggage. The briefcase never left his grip. Airport security would later describe him as visibly intoxicated, but coherent enough to navigate passport control without incident. What they did not know, what no one in that terminal could have known, was that the briefcase contained approximately 200 pages of classified Soviet military communications intercepts, encryption protocols for KGB residentūras across Western Europe, and a handwritten list of 12 active GRU officers operating under diplomatic cover in NATO capitals. The man's name was Pyotr Semyonovich Deryabin, a 34-year-old signals intelligence analyst assigned to the 1st Chief Directorate's Communications Security Section in Moscow. And in less than 6 hours, he would walk into the American embassy on Via Veneto, set the briefcase on the reception desk, and ask for political asylum in slurred but functional English. The Cold War, by the autumn of 1961, had entered a phase of what historians would later call managed escalation. The Berlin Wall had gone up 2 months earlier. The Bay of Pigs invasion had failed spectacularly in April. Khrushchev and Kennedy had met in Vienna in June, a summit that left both sides convinced the other was willing to risk nuclear confrontation over ideological principle. The intelligence services on both sides were operating under immense pressure to deliver actionable intelligence on military capabilities, political intentions, and, most critically, the loyalty and stability of the other side's personnel. Defections were not rare, but they were never routine. Each defector represented a potential intelligence windfall and a propaganda victory, but also a counterintelligence nightmare. Was the defector genuine? Was he a plant? What did he know, and what did his departure reveal about vulnerabilities in the system he had abandoned? The CIA's Soviet Russia Division, the British Secret Intelligence Service, and the West German Bundesnachrichtendienst all maintained dedicated defector reception protocols. But the operational reality was messy, unpredictable, and often shaped by factors as mundane as alcohol, desperation, and luck. Deryabin had not planned to defect, at least not in any structured, premeditated sense. He had been drinking heavily for 3 days. His marriage had collapsed 6 weeks earlier when his wife discovered he had been conducting an affair with a secretary in the Foreign Ministry's administrative pool. The affair itself was trivial, brief, transactional, emotionally empty. But the discovery triggered a formal inquiry by the KGB's 2nd Chief Directorate, the internal security apparatus responsible for monitoring Soviet citizens for ideological deviation and personal compromise. Deryabin was not arrested, but he was interviewed twice, stripped of his security clearance for sensitive compartmented information, and reassigned to a lower-tier analytical role reviewing routine diplomatic cable traffic. The reassignment was presented as temporary, a bureaucratic cooling-off period. But Deryabin understood the subtext. He was being assessed, his file was being annotated. His future in the intelligence apparatus was now contingent on demonstrating renewed loyalty and discipline. The psychological weight of that contingency, the sense of being watched, evaluated, and potentially discarded, had been unbearable. On October 11th, Deryabin had been sent to Vienna to attend a 3-day technical conference on secure communications infrastructure for Soviet embassies in neutral countries. The conference was procedural, tedious, and lightly attended. Deryabin spent most of the first 2 days in his hotel room drinking Czech Pilsner and Soviet-issue vodka from a flask he had brought from Moscow. On the evening of October 13th, he attended a reception at the Soviet embassy on Reisnerstrasse. He drank too much. He argued with a colleague from the Third Directorate about encryption key rotation protocols. He left the embassy around 10 p.m. and walked back to his hotel through the cold, wet streets of the First District. Somewhere during that walk, a decision crystallized. It was not a rational decision in any conventional sense. It was not the product of ideological disillusionment or moral awakening. It was the decision of a man who had concluded that the system he served would eventually destroy him, and that the only variable under his control was the timing and manner of that destruction. He returned to his hotel room, packed the briefcase with every classified document he had brought to Vienna, and took a taxi to the airport. He bought a ticket to Rome because Rome was far enough from Vienna to complicate immediate Soviet response, but close enough to reach on short notice. He chose the American embassy because the Americans had resources, leverage, and a reputation for protecting high-value defectors. He did not contact anyone in advance. He did not leave a note. He simply flew to Rome, got drunk on the plane, and decided he would finish what he had started. The briefcase was the key. Without it, Deryabin was just another disgruntled Soviet official with a personal grievance and no leverage. With it, he was the intelligence asset of potentially extraordinary value. The documents he carried included technical specifications for the KGB's primary cipher systems used in European operations, operational summaries of active intelligence gathering efforts targeting NATO military, installations, and personnel rosters that could be cross-referenced against known diplomatic postings to identify cover identities. The encryption protocols alone represented years of cryptanalytic work by Soviet signals intelligence units. If the Americans could exploit those protocols, they could potentially decrypt months or years of archived Soviet communications traffic. The personnel rosters were even more valuable in the short term. They gave the CIA and its allied services a roadmap for surveillance, recruitment, and disruption operations against Soviet intelligence networks across the continent. Deryabin arrived at the American embassy at approximately 5:20 a.m. on October 15th. The embassy, located in a 19th century palazzo on Via Veneto, was staffed 24 hours a day, but the overnight shift was minimal. A Marine security guard, a duty officer from the State Department's consular section, and a CIA officer assigned to the station's watch desk. Deryabin approached the main entrance, pressed the buzzer, and waited. The Marine Guard, a 22-year-old corporal from Ohio named Michael Hastings, opened the reinforced door and immediately assessed Deryabin as intoxicated, but non-threatening. Deryabin spoke in broken English. He said he was a Soviet official. He said he wanted to speak to someone from the American government. He said he had information. Hastings followed protocol. He did not allow Deryabin into the building. He asked Deryabin to wait outside while he contacted the duty officer. The duty officer, a mid-level Foreign Service officer named Robert Kellerman, came to the door, spoke briefly with Deryabin, and made a judgment call. He allowed Deryabin into the embassy's ground-floor reception area, a secure space separated from the main building by reinforced doors and surveillance cameras. Deryabin set the briefcase on the desk. He opened it. Kellerman saw Cyrillic text, official stamps, classification markings. He immediately contacted the CIA station chief. The station chief, a veteran officer named Thomas Braden, arrived at the embassy within 40 minutes. Braden had been asleep when he received the call, but he understood the potential significance immediately. A walk-in defector with documents was either an intelligence breakthrough or a provocation, and determining which required careful, methodical assessment. Braden brought 2 additional officers with him, a Russian-speaking case officer named Patricia Holt and a technical specialist from the Communications Security Division. They moved Daryabin to a secure room on the 3rd floor of the embassy, a windowless space used for debriefing and interrogation. They offered him coffee. They offered him food. They began the process of establishing his identity, his access, and his motivations. The initial debriefing lasted 11 hours. Daryabin was cooperative but erratic. He answered questions in detail, but his answers were sometimes contradictory or incomplete. He was still drunk for the first several hours, and his cognitive coherence improved only gradually as the alcohol metabolized. Holt, the case officer, focused on biographical details. His family, his education, his career trajectory, his reasons for defecting. The technical specialist focused on the documents, their classification level, their origin, their potential intelligence value. Braden focused on counterintelligence. Was Daryabin a genuine defector, or was he a dangle, a controlled agent sent by the KGB to feed disinformation or to identify American intelligence priorities? The documents appeared authentic. The classification markings were consistent with known Soviet protocols. The content was detailed, technical, and cross-referenced with other intelligence the CIA had collected through signals intercepts and human sources. The encryption protocols, in particular, matched the structure and complexity of systems the National Security Agency had been attempting to crack for years. But authenticity did not rule out provocation. The KGB was sophisticated enough to sacrifice real intelligence in order to achieve a larger strategic objective, such as identifying American cryptanalytic capabilities or mapping CIA defector reception procedures. Braden made a decision. He would treat Daryabin as a genuine defector pending further investigation, but he would also implement strict compartmentalization protocols to limit the potential damage if Daryabin turned out to be a double agent. The documents would be photographed, analyzed, and transmitted to CIA headquarters in Langley and to NSA's Signals Intelligence Division at Fort Meade. Daryabin himself would be moved to a secure safe house outside Rome and subjected to weeks of intensive debriefing and polygraph testing. The Soviet embassy in Rome would be notified of Daryabin's defection through formal diplomatic channels, but only after he had been moved to a location where Soviet attempts at recovery or retaliation would be operationally difficult. The Soviet response was swift and predictable. Within 24 hours of the formal notification, the Soviet ambassador to Italy, Nikolai Lunkov, issued a diplomatic protest accusing the United States of kidnapping a Soviet citizen and demanding his immediate return. The protest was pro forma, a ritual performance required by Moscow. No one expected the Americans to comply. The KGB's Rome Residentura, meanwhile, initiated a parallel effort to determine what Daryabin had taken and what he had disclosed. They reviewed his access logs, interviewed his colleagues in Vienna and Moscow, and attempted to reconstruct the contents of the briefcase based on what he would have been authorized to carry. The assessment was grim. Daryabin had access to some of the most sensitive communications security materials in the European theater. If he had brought those materials to the Americans, the damage would be extensive and long-lasting. Moscow's response to the defection revealed the internal tensions within the Soviet intelligence apparatus. The first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence, blamed the second chief directorate, responsible for internal security, for failing to detect Daryabin's psychological instability and personal vulnerabilities. The second chief directorate blamed the first chief directorate for assigning sensitive materials to an officer who had been flagged for personal misconduct. Both directorates blamed the administrative apparatus for allowing Daryabin to travel to Vienna without enhanced monitoring. The recriminations were intense, bureaucratic, and ultimately unproductive. Deryabin was gone. The documents were compromised. The only remaining question was how to mitigate the damage. The CIA's exploitation of Deryabin's materials took months. The encryption protocols were handed over to NSA's cryptanalysts, who used them to develop decryption algorithms for Soviet communications traffic, dating back to 1958. The personnel rosters were cross-referenced against surveillance logs, travel records, and known intelligence activities to build a comprehensive map of Soviet intelligence operations in Western Europe. Several of the officers identified in Deryabin's documents were subsequently expelled from their host countries on espionage charges. Others were placed under intensive surveillance, their communications monitored, their contacts mapped, their operational effectiveness degraded. The intelligence windfall was significant, but it was also time-sensitive. The Soviets would eventually realize the extent of the compromise and implement countermeasures, changing encryption systems, rotating personnel, altering operational protocols. The CIA had a narrow window to exploit Deryabin's information before it became obsolete. Deryabin himself was moved to the United States in early November 1961. He was flown on a military transport from Rome to a U.S. Air Force base in Germany, then transferred to a CIA safe house in rural Virginia. He spent the next 6 months in debriefing sessions, polygraph examinations, and psychological evaluations. The debriefings were exhaustive. CIA officers questioned him about every aspect of his career, his access, his knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations, and his reasons for defecting. The polygraph examinations were designed to detect deception, but they were also used to assess his psychological stability and his susceptibility to Soviet attempts at re-recruitment or manipulation. The psychological evaluations were conducted by agency psychiatrists who specialized in defector assessment. Their goal was to determine whether Deryabin was genuinely committed to his defection or whether he was experiencing regret, ambivalence, or psychological distress that could make him vulnerable to Soviet influence. The assessments were mixed. Deryabin was cooperative and forthcoming, but he was also emotionally volatile. He experienced periods of intense guilt about abandoning his family in Moscow. He expressed anger at the Soviet system, but also nostalgia for aspects of his former life. He drank heavily during the early months of his resettlement, a pattern that concerned his CIA handlers. The agency provided him with psychological counseling, financial support, and assistance in building a new identity. But the transition was difficult. Defection, even successful defection, was a form of exile. Deryabin had chosen freedom, but he had also chosen isolation, uncertainty, and the permanent loss of everything he had known. By mid-1962, Deryabin had been granted political asylum and provided with a new identity. He was given a modest stipend, a small apartment in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, and assistance in finding employment. The CIA continued to debrief him periodically on specific intelligence questions, but the intensive phase of his exploitation had ended. He was no longer a high-priority asset. He was a resettled defector, one of dozens the agency managed during the Cold War, and his long-term value was uncertain. The broader intelligence impact of Deryabin's defection became clearer over time. The encryption protocols he provided allowed NSA to decrypt thousands of Soviet communications, yielding insights into military planning, diplomatic strategy, and intelligence operations. The personnel rosters he brought enabled the CIA and allied services to disrupt Soviet networks across Europe, forcing Moscow to expend significant resources on damage control and operational restructuring. But the defection also had unintended consequences. It reinforced Soviet paranoia about internal security and led to a tightening of access controls, monitoring protocols, and loyalty vetting procedures within the intelligence services. It contributed to a climate of suspicion and fear that would persist throughout the remainder of the Cold War. Deryabin's personal story did not end neatly. He struggled with alcoholism and depression for years. He worked a series of low-level jobs: translator, consultant, administrative assistant, never fully integrating into American society. He maintained occasional contact with his CIA handlers, but the relationship was transactional and distant. He never saw his family again. His wife and children remained in Moscow, their lives shaped by the stigma of his defection. Soviet authorities denied them permission to emigrate, and Deryabin never attempted to contact them, fearing that any communication would expose them to further reprisals. In 1973, Deryabin agreed to participate in a debriefing session with a CIA historian who was compiling an internal study of Cold War defections. The session was recorded, and portions of the transcript were later declassified. In the recording, Deryabin reflects on his decision to defect. He describes it as both inevitable and irrational. He says he knew, even as he boarded the plane to Rome, that he was destroying his life. He says he did it anyway because the alternative, remaining in a system that had already marked him for destruction, felt worse. He says he does not regret the defection, but he does not celebrate it either. He describes it as a survival decision, not a moral or ideological choice. He says he thinks about his family every day. He says he wonders if they think about him. The question that remains, decades after the fact, is whether Deryabin's defection was worth the cost. From the CIA's perspective, the answer is unambiguous. The intelligence he provided was valuable, timely, and operationally significant. It contributed to the disruption of Soviet intelligence networks and the enhancement of American cryptanalytic capabilities. From Deryabin's perspective, the answer is more complicated. He survived. He escaped a system that would have eventually consumed him. But he also spent the rest of his life in a kind of limbo, neither fully Soviet nor fully American, defined by a single decision made in a moment of desperation and intoxication. The broader lesson of Deryabin's case is not about the mechanics of defection or the value of intelligence. It is about the human cost of Cold War espionage. The intelligence services on both sides treated people as assets, as sources of information to be exploited and discarded. Deryabin was valuable to the CIA as long as he had information to provide. Once that information was extracted, he became a logistical problem, a resettlement case, a line item in a budget. The Soviet system treated him the same way. He was useful as long as he was loyal and productive. Once he became a liability, he was expendable. The defection was his attempt to escape that logic, but it did not free him from it. It simply transferred him from one system to another, both of which measured his worth in terms of utility and risk. The documents Deryabin brought to Rome were eventually declassified in stages, beginning in the 1990s and continuing through the 2000s. The declassified materials confirm the intelligence value of his defection, but also reveal the extent to which the CIA struggled to assess his motivations and reliability. Internal memos from 1961 and 1962 show that some officers believed Deryabin was a genuine defector driven by personal desperation, while others suspected he might be a KGB plant designed to test American defector reception protocols or to feed disinformation. The debate was never fully resolved. Deryabin passed multiple polygraph examinations, and the intelligence he provided was corroborated by other sources, but the possibility of deception was never entirely eliminated. That uncertainty is characteristic of Cold War counterintelligence. Absolute certainty was rare. Decisions were made on the basis of probability, risk assessment, and operational necessity, not definitive proof. Diriabin died in 1998 at the age of 71 in a nursing home in suburban Maryland. His death was not widely reported. The CIA did not issue a public statement. His obituary in a local newspaper identified him as a retired translator and made no mention of his defection or his intelligence career. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Washington, D.C., in a grave marked with his American alias. There were no surviving family members at the funeral. A handful of former CIA officers attended, along with a representative from the agency's Office of Public Affairs. The service was brief and secular. No one delivered a eulogy. The story of Pyotr Diriabin is not unique. Dozens of Soviet officials defected to the West during the Cold War, each carrying their own mix of intelligence, grievances, and psychological burdens. Some became celebrated assets, their information reshaping Western understanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions. Others were quickly forgotten, their contributions modest or redundant, their resettlement difficult and incomplete. What distinguishes Diriabin's case is the starkness of the choice he faced and the clarity with which he understood its consequences. He knew he was trading one form of captivity for another. He knew he would never see his family again. He knew the Americans would use him and then discard him. He defected anyway, because the alternative was unacceptable. The Cold War was, at its core, a contest of systems. It was fought with nuclear arsenals and proxy wars, but it was also fought in the minds and lives of individuals like Diriabin, people who found themselves trapped between ideologies, institutions, and identities. The intelligence services on both sides understood this. They cultivated defectors, recruited agents, and exploited vulnerabilities because they knew that the most valuable intelligence often came from people who had been broken by the systems they served. Diriabin was broken by the Soviet system. The CIA did not repair him. It extracted what it needed and moved on. What remains unknown is whether Diriabin ever found peace. The declassified records contain operational assessments, debriefing transcripts, and polygraph results, but they do not contain answers to the questions that mattered most to him. Did his family survive the stigma of his defection? Did they understand why he left? Did they forgive him? The records are silent on these questions, and Diriabin himself left no memoir, no letters, no public accounting of his life after 1961. He disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of American intelligence, and when he died, he left behind only fragments, documents, recordings, memories held by a dwindling number of aging officers who had known him briefly and professionally. The briefcase he carried into the American embassy in Rome is preserved in the CIA's museum at Langley, a small, unremarkable leather case with worn handles and a broken clasp. It sits in a display case alongside other artifacts from the Cold War, a U-2 spy plane camera, a KGB cipher machine, a fragment of the Berlin Wall. The placard next to the briefcase identifies it as belonging to a Soviet defector and notes that the materials it contained contributed to significant intelligence gains in the early 1960s. It does not mention Diriabin by name. It does not mention the alcohol, the desperation, the broken marriage, or the family left behind. It presents the briefcase as a symbol of intelligence success, a tangible representation of the West's ability to exploit Soviet vulnerabilities. But the briefcase is also a symbol of something else: the human cost of espionage, the lives disrupted and destroyed in the service of abstract geopolitical objectives, the individuals who became instruments of state power and were discarded when their utility expired. The Cold War ended in 1991, but its human consequences persist. Deryabin's family, if they are still alive, live in a Russia that is no longer Soviet, but is still shaped by the legacies of that system. The intelligence officers who debriefed him are retired or dead. The encryption protocols he compromised have long since been replaced. The personnel he identified have retired, defected, or died. But the pattern he embodied, the individual caught between systems, making impossible choices under unbearable pressure, remains relevant. It is the pattern of every defector, every double agent, every person who finds themselves trapped in the machinery of state power and decides, for reasons rational or irrational, to escape. Deryabin's story is a reminder that intelligence is not an abstract game played by institutions. It is a human enterprise, conducted by people with families, fears, and vulnerabilities. The systems that employ them, whether Soviet or American, KGB or CIA, treat them as assets, but they are not assets. They are people, and the decisions they make, the sacrifices they endure, and the costs they bear are real and irreversible. Deryabin chose defection. He chose survival. He chose exile. And he spent the rest of his life living with the consequences of that choice in a country that valued him for what he brought, but never fully accepted him for who he was.